Right now, the Pacific Ocean is heating up, and the last time it heated up this fast, crops failed on 4 continents. We are heading into a super El Niño. Scientists put the odds at 82%. It will hit on top of the warmest global baseline in human history. Ahead, we will cover drowned cities, forests on fire, disease outbreaks crossing new borders, and the collapse of food systems that feed billions. If you find this valuable, subscribe and stay with us. Brace yourself, we begin. Picture the Pacific Ocean. It stretches wider than all the land on Earth combined, and right now, sitting near the centre of it, a pool of water the size of the continental United States is getting warmer. That pool controls your weather. It controls the rain falling on rice farms in Asia. It controls the drought drying out rivers in Central America. It controls whether the Amazon burns or survives another year. One body of water, half a planet away, and it is heating up faster than it has in decades. El Niño is a climate pattern. It happens when a massive section of the tropical Pacific Ocean warms above its normal temperature. The word itself is Spanish for the little boy, but there is nothing little about it. When this warming kicks in, it changes weather patterns across the entire globe. Droughts, floods, fires, disease outbreaks, food shortages, all connected back to that one warm pool in the Pacific. Here is how it normally works. The Pacific Ocean has a temperature system. The western side near Asia and Australia runs warm. The eastern side near South America runs cool. Trade winds blow from east to west along the equator and help keep things in balance. They push warm surface water westward like a conveyor belt. They keep cool water near the surface on the American side. That balance is the foundation of global weather. It drives rainfall patterns from California to India to Brazil. It sets the rhythm for monsoon seasons that billions of farmers depend on to grow food. When El Niño starts, that balance breaks. The trade winds weaken. The warm water that was being pushed west stops moving. Then it slides back east toward South America. A massive blanket of heat spreads across the central and eastern Pacific. And when all that warmth hits the atmosphere above it, the energy transfer is enormous. Think of it like this. The ocean is a giant battery. Under normal conditions, it stores heat quietly in the west. When El Niño arrives, that battery discharges, all at once. The heat surges up into the atmosphere and reshapes the entire pattern of global weather. The jet stream, a powerful river of wind 6 miles above your head, gets pushed off course. The storm tracks shift. The rain falls in the wrong places. The dry places get drier. The wet places flood. Scientists have been tracking El Niño events for decades. The strong ones in 1997 and 1998 caused crop failures across Asia, fires that consumed hundreds of millions of acres, and floods that killed thousands in South America. Those events cost the global economy over $45 billion in damage, and that was before global temperatures had risen as far as they have today. The 2026 El Niño is developing on a planet already running hotter than at any point in recorded human history. Every impact from this warm pool in the Pacific gets multiplied by the heat that is already here. The floods go deeper, the droughts go longer, the fires spread faster. Scientists at the Climate Prediction Center issued their warning in May, 82% chance of a strong El Niño forming between May and July, a 96% chance it holds through the winter of 2026 to 2027. This is not a storm that passes in a weekend. This is a global disruption that will last over a year, and the place where it all begins, where the warm water first started spreading, is also where the first system breaks. The winds that hold the ocean in balance are already losing their grip, and once they let go completely, what happens next reshapes everything. Speed matters in weather. A slow storm gives you time to prepare. A fast one catches everything off guard. The 2026 El Niño is forming fast. Faster than scientists expected. Faster than the models predicted even 6 months ago. And the speed of its formation is one of the most alarming signals researchers have seen in decades. In a normal El Niño year, the warming of the Pacific builds gradually over several months. Sea surface temperatures creep up slowly. Forecasters have time to issue warnings, Farmers have time to adjust planting schedules. Governments have time to build up emergency food supplies. The system responds to a signal it has seen before. But the 2026 event skipped the slow build-up. Sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern tropical Pacific jumped sharply in early spring. By April, the readings were already flashing warnings. By May, the Climate Prediction Center had locked in its forecast. The heat was already there, already spreading. The temperature anomaly, the gap between what the ocean normally reads and what it is actually reading, is expected to exceed 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, above normal in the central Pacific. That is the threshold that separates a moderate event from a major one. And forecasters believe it will push higher. To put that in terms you can picture, imagine every square mile of the Pacific Ocean, across a stretch the size of the entire continental United States, suddenly running a fever. A persistent, building fever that pumps heat into the atmosphere 24 hours a day. Previous strong El Niño events, the kind that matched this one in intensity, took the better part of a year to reach their peak. The 2026 event is running ahead of that schedule by several months. That compression changes everything about how the world responds. Emergency food programs need lead time to work. When a drought forms slowly, farmers can switch crops, governments can import grain, and supply chains can adjust. When conditions shift fast, those systems get caught mid-step. The worst famines in El Niño history happened when the speed of the event outran the speed of the response. There is another reason the speed is alarming. A faster build-up often points toward a higher peak. The energy feeding this event is coming partly from the ocean, and partly from the warmer atmosphere sitting above it. Global average temperatures have already risen by nearly 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, above the baseline from just a few decades ago. That extra heat in the atmosphere acts like fuel. It feeds the ocean warming, it accelerates the timeline. Scientists are debating exactly how strong the peak will be. Some models point toward what would qualify as a super El Niño. Others suggest it may settle just below that line. But across almost every model, the speed of formation is a consistent warning signal. The communities most vulnerable to this event are not waiting on model debates. Farmers in Southeast Asia are already adjusting planting decisions. Emergency planners in Central America are already mapping water reserves. Food agencies are already calculating how much grain buffer exists if multiple harvests fail at once. The answer to that last question is not a comfortable one. And while the speed of the ocean's warming tells one story, the winds above it are telling another. Because the system that normally pumps that warm water westward and holds it in place is already weakening. When it breaks down completely, the chain of consequences begins, and the next link in that chain lands on the most overlooked part of the whole system. Every day, without anyone noticing, a pair of invisible rivers of wind circle the Earth along the equator. They blow from east to west, steady and reliable, across thousands of miles of open ocean. They are called trade winds, and for most of human history, they have been the reason the world's weather works. These winds do something remarkable. They push the warm surface water of the Pacific westward, piling it up near Australia and Southeast Asia. That creates a deep, warm reservoir of water on the western side of the ocean, and a cooler, upwelling zone on the eastern side near Peru and Ecuador. That temperature difference is not just an ocean fact. It is the engine that drives rainfall across South Asia, East Africa, and South America. Monsoons, growing seasons, river levels, all depend on those winds maintaining the balance. Now picture the trade winds like a taut rubber band stretched across the Pacific. Under normal conditions, they hold the warm water in place on the western end. The tension is constant. The system stays in balance. When El Niño starts, that tension releases. The trade winds weaken, sometimes dramatically. The rubber band goes slack. The massive pile of warm water that was held on the western side sloshes back eastward. It floods the central Pacific with heat. And the cooling effect that normally exists near South America disappears. In the 2026 event, scientists observed the weakening of the trade winds starting as early as February. By April, the signals were clear. The warm water was already moving east. The slosh had begun. When that warm water reaches the central Pacific, it does not just raise ocean temperatures, it changes the entire atmosphere above it. Warm water heats the air sitting over it. That warm air rises. Rising air creates thunderstorms, rainfall, and low-pressure systems. Those systems pull the jet stream south and stretch it across the Americas. On the other side of the Pacific, the loss of warm water causes the opposite effect. The air over the western Pacific cools and sinks. Sinking air suppresses rainfall. That is why Australia, Indonesia, and the Philippines go dry during El Niño years. The warm water that used to fuel their rainy seasons is gone. One shift in wind speed halfway around the world can dry out a rice paddy in the Philippines or flood a valley in Peru. That is how connected the system is. The most disorienting part of this process is how fast the transition can happen once the trade winds weaken past a certain point. There is a threshold. Below a certain wind speed, the process accelerates on its own. The warmer the eastern Pacific gets, the less the trade winds want to blow. The less they blow, the warmer the eastern Pacific gets. It feeds itself. In past El Niño years, scientists watched this feedback loop run for months before the peak. In 2026, the loop locked in earlier than expected. And once it locks in, the reshaping of global weather becomes systematic. Rainfall moves, droughts begin, floods build. The disruption spreads continent by continent. The next thing to shift is the structure that carries all that disruption from the ocean to the places people actually live. A river of wind so powerful it can move weather systems across an entire hemisphere. And in an El Niño year, it goes haywire. 6 miles above your head, right now, a river of wind is moving at speeds up to 200 miles per hour. It circles the entire planet. It carries storm systems from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic. It controls where it rains, where it snows, and where it stays dry for months at a time. Pilots use it to save fuel on cross-country flights. Meteorologists use it to predict weather weeks in advance. It is called the jet stream, and El Niño bends it. Under normal conditions, the jet stream over North America flows roughly from west to east, across the northern half of the continent. It carries Pacific storms into the Pacific Northwest, drops snow over the Rockies, and steers winter cold fronts through the Midwest. The pattern is not perfectly predictable, but it has a general shape that forecasters have mapped for decades. When El Niño heats the central Pacific, that enormous release of energy pushes the jet stream south. It stretches it. It strengthens the southern track while weakening the northern one. The result is a completely different weather map for the United States and large parts of the rest of the world. States in the southern United States get wetter. California and the Southwest, which are normally dry in winter, can get drenched by storms that ride the shifted jet. The Pacific Northwest and northern states get warmer and drier than normal. The Great Lakes region gets milder winters. The Gulf Coast sees more rainfall. The whole country runs on a different setting. But the jet stream shift extends far beyond North America. The same energy that bends it over the Pacific reshapes it over the Atlantic and Europe as well. Parts of southern Europe see more storms. Northern Europe warms. The Mediterranean dries. A single warming event in the central Pacific sends ripples through weather systems thousands of miles away. In 2026, scientists are watching the jet stream more carefully than usual. The heat already in the atmosphere from climate change means the baseline position of the jet stream has already shifted slightly from where it was 30 years ago. El Niño arriving on top of that means the stream gets pushed further south than any historical comparison fully prepares us for. For regular people, the most immediate consequence is unpredictability. The storm that was supposed to follow the usual track does not. The drought that was supposed to ease in spring stays through summer. The city that never floods gets hit by back-to-back storms. Emergency managers have learned to plan for El Niño winters, but the 2026 version is operating outside the range of the historical playbook. There is one more consequence of the jet stream shift that most people never hear about. When the stream strengthens and shifts south over North America, it creates more atmospheric turbulence at altitude. Commercial flights crossing the continent hit rougher air than passengers and crew are used to. Airlines have already begun adjusting flight paths. It is a minor inconvenience compared to what is happening on the ground, but it is a sign of how deep into daily life the jet stream's shift reaches. every system connected to predictable weather gets disrupted. Planting calendars, reservoir management, wildfire preparation, insurance pricing. But the disruption to precipitation, to where the rain actually falls and where it stops entirely, creates a crisis with a name that forecasters are using more and more. And that crisis is already spreading across 2 continents at once. There is enough fresh water on Earth to sustain every living person. The problem is where it ends up. El Niño does not destroy water, it moves it. It pulls rain away from places that depend on steady rainfall for survival, and dumps it in places that cannot absorb or use what arrives. The result is a global mismatch between where water falls and where water is needed. Meteorologists have started using a term for this condition: global water bankruptcy. The term is stark for a reason. Bankruptcy means the system cannot meet its obligations. Water bankruptcy means the hydrological system, the global network of rainfall, rivers and reservoirs, stops delivering what societies were built to expect. In a water bankrupt world, there are 2 simultaneous disasters. The first is drought. Regions that depend on consistent rainfall see their rivers drop, their reservoirs shrink, and their crops wither. The second is flooding. Regions hit by abnormal storm activity get overwhelmed. Infrastructure fails. Fields wash out. Drinking water gets contaminated. And here is the cruel part. The flooded regions often end up with less usable water than they started with, because the water arrives so fast and so dirty that it destroys the systems meant to capture it. El Niño creates both disasters at the same time on opposite sides of the world. The atmospheric mechanism is straightforward. El Niño's warm water in the central Pacific heats the air above it. That warm air rises, forms massive storm systems, and dumps extraordinary rainfall on the eastern Pacific, western South America, and parts of North America. Meanwhile, the western Pacific loses its warm water. The air there cools, rainfall collapses. The dry side of the planet gets drier. The crisis arriving in 2026 is amplified by the fact that many regions entering this El Niño are already in deficit. Aquifers across South Asia, the Middle East, and parts of North Africa have been drawn down for decades. Rivers that once ran year-round now dry up seasonally. The water reserves that used to buffer communities through a single bad year are already partially gone. A region with full reserves can survive one drought year. A region already running low cannot. El Niño does not create water scarcity. It exposes the scarcity that was already there. The timeline for water bankruptcy is not measured in years. It moves in weeks. A reservoir that takes 3 years to fill can empty in a single dry season. A river system that feeds millions of farms can drop below agricultural minimums in a matter of months if the monsoon fails or arrives late. In 2026, the monsoon arriving late or weaker than expected in South Asia would affect the single largest block of agricultural land on Earth. The crop cycles are timed to the monsoon. Farmers plant based on when the rains historically arrive. If the rains arrive 3 weeks late, the entire harvest calendar shifts. If they arrive 6 weeks late or less than half, the normal volume falls, the harvest fails outright. The regions facing that scenario right now are home to hundreds of millions of people, and the same El Niño system driving drought in Asia is simultaneously preparing something even more violent for the other side of the ocean. The place where the water crashes in, rather than staying away, is already bracing for something it has rarely seen before. There is a strip of land running through Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador and Nicaragua where the rain has been failing. The locals have a name for this region. They call it the Dry Corridor, and in an El Niño year, it earns that name in a way that destroys lives. The Dry Corridor sits in a geographic position that makes it especially sensitive to the shift in Pacific weather. The Pacific Ocean to the west provides most of the moisture that sustains agriculture in this region. When El Niño disrupts that moisture source, the rains become erratic, arrive late, and fall well below what farmers need to grow a full crop cycle. Families in this region have farmed the same land for generations. They grow corn, beans, and sorghum. These are subsistence crops, meaning the family eats what they grow. A bad harvest year does not mean lower income, it means hunger. During the 2015 to 2016 El Niño, parts of the dry corridor received less than 40% of their normal rainfall during the growing season. Crop failures reached catastrophic levels. Over 2 million people required emergency food assistance. Children showed up at clinics with acute malnutrition. And that event hit a region that still had some resilience left. The 2026 version is arriving in a region that has spent the last several years in a fragile recovery. Soil moisture levels in parts of Guatemala and Honduras are already below their seasonal averages. Aquifers are lower, seed reserves are smaller, the safety margin is thinner. For a farmer in this corridor, the calculation is brutal and simple. The corn plant needs water at specific stages of its growth. The germination phase, the flowering phase, the grain fill phase. If the rain fails during any one of these windows, the plant produces almost nothing. If it fails during 2 of them, the plant dies. El Niño shifts the rainfall calendar in ways that hit multiple growth windows at once. Scientists who study this region use a specific phrase, the planting window is closing. What they mean is that the window of weeks in which a farmer can plant and reasonably expect enough rainfall to complete the crop cycle is getting shorter every decade. In a super El Niño year, that window can close almost entirely. Farmers who understand what is coming are already switching to drought-resistant seed varieties. These varieties mature faster and need less water. The trade-off is that they produce a smaller harvest. A family that normally stores enough food for 10 months may end up with enough for 6. That is a hard choice. And for families already eating lean, 6 months of food means 4 months of crisis. The dry corridor also sits at the origin point of one of the largest migration pressures in the Western Hemisphere. When harvests fail for multiple consecutive years, people leave. They move towards cities, toward the coast, and often toward the United States border. The 2026 El Niño is expected to drive another wave of climate migration out of this region, according to emergency planners and aid organizations already positioned there. The fields are dry, the forecasts are dire, and the people most affected have the fewest tools to respond. But directly across the mountains from this drought zone, on the Pacific coast of South America, the opposite catastrophe is already building. On the Pacific coast of South America, the coastline of Peru and Ecuador sits at the edge of one of the driest deserts on Earth under normal conditions. Cities like Lima, Peru's capital of over 10 million people, get almost no rain in a typical year. The whole region is built for dryness. Water comes from rivers fed by glaciers in the Andes Mountains. Infrastructure is designed around scarcity. Then El Niño arrives. When the warm Pacific water floods back eastward and reaches the South American coast, the atmosphere above it goes haywire. The normally dry air over the coast suddenly sits above water that is several degrees warmer than usual. The heat drives intense evaporation. Moisture builds in the atmosphere. Then it collapses in the form of torrential rain that the region has almost no infrastructure to handle. During the 1997 to 1998 El Niño, which is the strongest on record for comparison, northern Peru received as much rain in a single month as it would normally receive in a decade. Rivers that were usually dry stream beds became raging torrents 40 feet wide. Entire hillside neighborhoods slid into valleys below. Roads built on ground that had been dry for centuries dissolved overnight. The damage took years to repair. The 2026 El Niño is tracking toward a similar intensity, and the region has grown significantly since then. More people live in flood-vulnerable zones on hillsides and riverbanks. More infrastructure sits in paths that turned into rivers in 1998. Urban planners built for the dry normal, not for this. Here is the cruel paradox. In a region that desperately needs water for its population and agriculture, the arriving flood is largely unusable. The water comes too fast. It overwhelms drainage systems built for light rain. It picks up soil, waste, and debris as it runs off. By the time it reaches any collection point, it is too contaminated to use without treatment. The treatment infrastructure in most of these cities is not built to process water at this volume or this level of contamination. So the city drowns in water it cannot drink. The rivers fill with water too dangerous to irrigate crops. The flood destroys the very piping systems that distribute clean water to households. And in the aftermath, the clean water supply is often worse than it was before the rains came. Emergency managers call this the infrastructure trap. The storm destroys the systems designed to handle the storm. Flooding in cities also moves fast in ways that catch people off guard. A city that gets 2 inches of rain in a year can be overwhelmed by 2 inches of rain in 2 hours. The ground cannot absorb it. The drains cannot move it. The streets become rivers within an hour of a major downpour. Cars stall. Emergency vehicles cannot reach people. Hospitals fill. Within days of heavy flooding in this region, the second wave begins. Contaminated water seeps into wells and municipal water lines. Waterborne disease cases start climbing at clinics. Mosquitoes breed in standing water left behind by floods. The public health response stretches thin. The flooding is devastating. But the disaster that follows the flooding, the disease surge that no one is fully prepared for, is in many ways more dangerous. And it is not only South America dealing with it. Farther across the ocean, hundreds of millions of people are watching a different kind of disaster form, one that threatens something even more fundamental than drinking water. Rice feeds more human beings than any other food on Earth. Across Asia, it is breakfast, lunch, and dinner for billions of families. It is the calorie that keeps cities running and rural populations alive. And the vast majority of it grows in a narrow band of countries, including the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Bangladesh, all sitting directly in the drought zone of a major El Niño event. The threat here is specific. Rice is a water-intensive crop. It does not tolerate drought well. During its critical growth phases, it needs steady, predictable water availability. In most of Southeast Asia, that water comes from monsoon rains, river systems fed by mountain snowmelt, and irrigation networks that draw from both. El Niño attacks all 3 of those sources at once. It weakens and delays the monsoon. It reduces mountain snowpack in the Himalayas and other ranges that feed major river systems. It lowers river levels used for irrigation. A rice farmer in the Philippines or the Mekong Delta of Vietnam does not experience a single problem. They experience 3 simultaneous ones. The Philippine Department of Agriculture made its projection public in early 2026. The country could see a drop of up to 700,000 metric tons in rice production during the El Niño year. To put that in physical terms, 700,000 metric tons of rice is enough to feed roughly 12 million people for an entire year. That is rice that will disappear from the food supply, and it will need to be replaced from somewhere. The problem is that every country in the region faces the same drought pressure. The global rice market, which countries turn to when their own production falls short, depends on a small number of exporting nations. Thailand and Vietnam are the 2 largest rice exporters on the planet. Both sit in the El Niño drought zone. Both face production declines. When every major buyer enters the market at the same time and every major seller has less to offer, prices spike. Rice prices doubled briefly during the 2007 food crisis, which was driven partly by weather and partly by export restrictions. The 2026 El Niño carries the conditions to repeat or exceed that scenario. For a family in Manila or Jakarta that spends a large share of its income on food, a doubling of rice prices is an emergency. Rice becomes unaffordable before other staples do because it is already such a large portion of household spending. Families cut portions, children lose weight. The health system begins to see the downstream effects of malnutrition before the harvest failure numbers are even officially reported. Governments in the region are not passive. Several have already begun releasing emergency stockpiles, negotiating trade agreements, and subsidizing prices. But emergency stockpiles have limits. They are built for a single bad season, not for a year-long drought affecting the entire region simultaneously. And beneath the food crisis, there is a second pressure building. The farms that cannot grow enough rice are farms that also cannot pay their farmers. Rural income collapses. Agricultural workers move towards cities, where jobs are also scarce during an economic slowdown. Urban stress compounds the food stress. The rice crisis is visible. The numbers are measurable, but the farming crisis runs deeper than the crop, And the next pressure squeezing farmers has nothing to do with rain. Even in years when the rain cooperates, growing food is expensive. Seeds, labour, equipment, water and fertiliser all cost money. Farmers calculate tight margins every planting season. A good harvest pays for this year's costs and next year's seeds. A bad harvest means debt. Now take a bad harvest caused by El Niño drought and add a global fertiliser price surge on top of it. That is the specific combination crushing farmers across Southeast Asia, South Asia and Central America right now. Fertiliser prices climbed sharply after supply chain disruptions starting in 2022 and have remained elevated due to ongoing geopolitical pressures on natural gas markets. Natural gas is the primary input for nitrogen fertiliser, the most widely used type in the world. When gas prices rise, fertiliser prices follow, and when fertiliser becomes expensive, farmers use less of it. Using less fertiliser produces less food per acre. A farmer who cuts fertiliser application by a third can expect a drop in yield of 20 to 30% even in a year with perfect rainfall. In a year with El Niño drought, the combination of reduced water and reduced fertiliser can push yield drops well past 50%. 50% means half the crop. For a subsistence farmer, that is the difference between feeding the family and watching the family go hungry. For a commercial farm supplying a regional market, it means a dramatic reduction in supply hitting the market at exactly the moment prices are already rising. The trap works like this. Fertiliser costs too much to buy in full. The farmer buys less. The reduced application lowers the yield. The lower yield earns less money. There is less cash to buy fertiliser next season. The spiral tightens. What makes 2026 different from past fertiliser crunches is the simultaneity of the pressure. Multiple major growing regions are all facing the same combination at the same time. South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Africa and Central America all entered this El Niño year with elevated input costs and reduced financial reserves from years of weather-related setbacks and economic stress. When one region fails, global food markets can absorb some of the shock. When multiple regions fail at once, the absorptive capacity of the global system gets tested in a way that has rarely happened in modern history. Historical data on strong El Niño events shows that global food prices rise by an average of 20 to 40% in the following year. The elevated fertiliser costs of 2026 mean there is already a floor under food prices that was not there during past El Niño cycles. The 20 to 40% increase would land on top of prices that are already elevated. For wealthy nations, a 40% increase in food prices is painful. It shows up in grocery bills, it squeezes household budgets, it causes political tension. For low-income nations where families spend 60 to 70% of their income on food, a 40% price increase is a humanitarian crisis. Governments face the choice of subsidising food at enormous expense or watching their populations descend into food insecurity. Some nations have reserves and credit lines to manage this, others do not. And the gap between those two groups widens dramatically under the pressure of a super El Niño. What happens to the countries that cannot absorb the shock is a crisis of its own, and it reveals something fundamental about how inequality is baked into the very structure of global food systems. When food prices spike, wealthy nations reach into their wallets. Low-income nations reach a wall. This is one of the least discussed dimensions of El Niño. The physical disaster is global. The economic damage is not spread evenly. It lands hardest on the places least equipped to survive it. And the 2026 event is arriving at a moment when that inequality has deepened significantly. A wealthy country facing a food price surge has multiple shock absorbers. It has financial reserves to subsidize food prices. It has agricultural diversity, meaning crops from multiple regions and systems, so one failure does not cause a national shortage. It has strong trade relationships that let it quickly source food from wherever is still producing. And it has a population where food represents a small enough share of household spending that a price increase causes hardship but not starvation. A low-income country has almost none of those buffers. Many are dependent on a small number of crops grown in a single agroclimatic zone. If that zone gets hit by drought, there is no backup. Many have limited foreign exchange reserves, meaning they cannot afford to buy replacement food on the international market even when it is available, and many already carry debt from previous climate disasters. The economic term for this vulnerability is food import dependency. Countries that produce less food than they consume must buy the difference on world markets. When global prices rise, their import bills rise. When they cannot pay those bills, shelves empty. Several nations in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the Caribbean are currently classified as highly import-dependent for staple foods. Their governments entered 2026 with thin reserves and significant existing debt. El Niño arriving in this context does not create a temporary hardship. It can tip a country from fragility to collapse. One of the specific pathways to collapse is a currency crisis. When a country must spend large amounts of foreign currency buying emergency food imports, it drains its reserves. A depleted reserve weakens the national currency. A weaker currency makes all imports more expensive, including energy, medicine, and manufacturing inputs. The food crisis becomes an economic crisis, becomes a political crisis. That sequence has played out before. During the 1997 to 1998 El Niño, economic crises across Southeast Asia deepened partly because of the agricultural disruption layered on top of financial market stress. Countries that went into that period with strong reserves weathered it. Countries that did not faced years of economic setback. For ordinary people inside these countries, the most visible sign of the crisis is the market. The price of a bag of rice that was $10 last month is $14 this month, then $18. The household that was already stretching its budget does not have an easy adjustment to make. It eats less. It pulls children from school to work. It delays medical care. These decisions compound over time. International food aid programs exist specifically to respond to these situations. The World Food Programme and regional bodies try to fill the gap when governments cannot. But those programs are also resource constrained. A global El Niño event, affecting multiple continents simultaneously, strains international aid capacity in ways that a single country crisis does not. The rich absorb. The poor collapse. And while the food system strains under this pressure, a completely different disaster is building in the forests. One that, by mid-2026, is already out of control in places people thought were safe. The Amazon rainforest covers an area roughly the size of the continental United States. It holds around 10% of all living species on Earth. Its trees release so much water vapor that they generate their own rainfall. Scientists call this the flying rivers, invisible streams of moisture that travel through the atmosphere and water the entire South American continent. But the Amazon is sick, and El Niño is about to make it critical. For the last several decades, logging and land clearing have steadily eaten away at the forest's edges and interior. Currently, scientists estimate that around 40% of the Amazon has been degraded to some degree. This means the trees are thinner, the canopy is more open, the ground is drier, and the forest's ability to generate its own moisture has weakened. A healthy, intact rainforest is nearly impossible to burn. The canopy is so dense that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. The soil stays moist year-round. Even in the dry season, the interior of a healthy Amazon section holds enough moisture to resist ignition. A degraded Amazon does not have those protections. When logging opens the canopy, sunlight penetrates and dries the leaf litter on the forest floor. When drought reduces rainfall, the drying accelerates. The forest that once resisted fire becomes a forest that burns. El Niño is the trigger that turns the degraded areas into active fire zones. The rainfall suppression that El Niño causes over the Amazon can cut normal dry season rainfall by 30 to 50% in affected regions. In a degraded forest, that level of drying creates conditions where a single spark, whether from lightning, a cooking fire at the forest edge, or a deliberate land-clearing burn, can start a fire that grows beyond any capacity to control it. The 2019 Amazon fire season, which generated global headlines and international alarm, happened during a moderately dry year without a major El Niño event. Over 3 million acres burned in a matter of weeks during peak fire season. The 2026 dry season will arrive with El Niño suppressing rainfall over a forest that has been further degraded since 2019. The conditions forecasters are modelling are significantly more extreme than what drove those 2019 fires. Large fires in the Amazon are not just an ecological disaster, they release enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which accelerates the warming that drives future El Niño events and climate stress. A major Amazon fire season feeds the very conditions that make the next fire season worse. Scientists call this a tipping point feedback loop. There is also a human cost that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Over 30 million people live in or near the Amazon, including hundreds of indigenous communities whose entire way of life, food system, water supply and cultural identity is tied to the intact forest. When fire moves through their territory, it destroys in hours what took centuries to grow. Smoke from large Amazon fires travels. During major fire years, cities as far as 1,000 miles from the burning zones have seen air quality drop to dangerous levels. Hospitals fill with respiratory patients, schools close. Outdoor workers face health risks they have no way to avoid. The Amazon is approaching a threshold. Most scientists agree on that. What they are still debating is whether 2026 is the year it crosses it. And the answer depends partly on how severe the El Niño turns out to be. But the Amazon fire threat, as alarming as it is, may not even be the largest wildfire crisis that 2026 produces, because the numbers already on the board before El Niño even fully formed are already historic. Most years, wildfire season feels like a regional story. California burns, Australia burns, Siberia burns. The news covers it for a week, then the next story takes over. In 2026, the numbers before summer even started were historic. By the time El Niño officially began forming, researchers tracking global wildfire data counted more than 150 million acres burned worldwide since January. That is an area larger than the entire state of Texas. 150 million acres, and El Niño had not even peaked yet. To understand what that number means, it helps to think about what an acre on fire actually looks like. A single burning acre can produce a column of smoke visible from 30 miles away. The heat at the fire's centre can reach temperatures that melt road asphalt. A fire moving through dry grassland in a 30-mile-per-hour wind travels faster than a person can run. Now multiply that by 150 million. The smoke from that total area covers entire continents. The carbon released into the atmosphere is equivalent to years of industrial emissions. The ecosystems destroyed will take generations to recover, if they recover at all. The reason fire activity was already at these levels before El Niño peaked is the baseline heat problem. The planet is running hotter than it was even 15 years ago. Soil moisture levels in fire-prone regions are lower. Vegetation dries out earlier in the spring and stays dry longer into the fall. Fire seasons, which used to last 3 or 4 months, now run 6 to 8 months in many regions. El Niño arriving into this environment does not start the fire problem. It throws gasoline on a fire that was already burning. The Pacific Northwest of the United States is one of the regions facing a particularly serious 2026 outlook. Under El Niño conditions, the Pacific Northwest typically sees a warm, dry winter and spring. Snowpack in the Cascades builds less than normal. Summer arrives with rivers running lower than usual and vegetation already moisture-stressed. Fire weather conditions, meaning hot, dry, windy days where fire spreads fastest, arrive earlier and last longer. Parts of the American West have been in what hydrologists call a mega drought for over 2 decades. The Colorado River Basin has lost roughly 2/3 of its water volume compared to the middle of the 20th century. This regional moisture deficit acts as kindling. El Niño in 2026 adds the spark conditions. Beyond North America, fire risks are elevated across southern Europe, sub-Saharan Africa, and large sections of Australia. The global fire risk map looks, in the words of one climate scientist reviewing 2026 projections, like a map of everywhere. Emergency responders are already stretched. Fire seasons no longer end cleanly before the next one begins. Suppression crews work longer seasons with fewer recovery days. Equipment costs more. Air tanker fleets are aging. The logistical capacity of fire management systems was built for a different climate than the one currently burning. The damage is measurable in acres and dollars. The human dimension is harder to quantify, but just as real. Communities that evacuate once often rebuild and evacuate again. The repeated trauma of losing a home, a neighbourhood, a landscape that was familiar, compounds over time. But fire is not the only thing spreading in the heat and drought. Something far smaller, and in some ways far more dangerous, is also moving. The American West is a region that already knows fire: California, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, Colorado. These states have spent the last 20 years watching fire seasons grow longer, hotter, and more destructive. The names of burned communities have become a grim list: Paradise, Talent, Lahaina, entire towns erased in hours. El Niño years have a specific impact on the American West that forecasters have mapped across decades of data. The pattern is consistent. El Niño brings dry, warm winters to the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies. Snowpack builds thin. Spring runoff comes early and leaves early. By June, vegetation moisture levels drop below the threshold where fires ignite easily and spread fast. The 2025 to 2026 winter across the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies trended warm and dry, which matches exactly what a developing El Niño winter typically produces. That means going into the 2026 fire season, the region carries a moisture deficit in its soils and vegetation. The fuel load in many western forests is also historically high. Decades of aggressive fire suppression, a policy that made sense in the short term but compounded into a long-term problem, left forests packed with dense undergrowth, standing dead trees, and accumulated debris that would have burned off in regular low-intensity fires under natural conditions. When fire does enter these fuel-loaded forests, it burns with an intensity that is nearly impossible to suppress. A single red flag weather day, meaning wind above 30 miles per hour combined with relative humidity below 15% and temperatures above 90 degrees, can take a small ignition and turn it into a 100,000-acre fire in under 24 hours. Fire seasons in El Niño years produce more red flag days, earlier in the season, and they last longer. The communities most at risk are those sitting in what fire scientists call the wildland-urban interface, the zone where neighbourhoods meet undeveloped or forested land. Tens of millions of Americans live in this zone. Many of them moved there in the last 20 years, drawn by lower home prices compared to city centres. They are now the first line of fire exposure. Insurance companies have already begun exiting parts of California and other high-risk fire states. When major insurers withdraw, homeowners lose access to coverage that makes mortgages possible. Entire neighbourhoods become financially non-viable to own property in. The fire crisis becomes a housing crisis. Water is the other pressure point. Many western cities get their water from reservoirs fed by snowmelt. In El Niño years with weak snowpack, those reservoirs enter summer at lower than normal levels. Water managers impose restrictions. Agriculture in the Central Valley and other irrigated regions gets squeezed. Farmers fallow fields, meaning they deliberately leave land unplanted to conserve water. Each fallowed field is one less unit of food entering the supply chain. The West fire problem in 2026 is a combination of drought legacy, fuel accumulation, warming baseline, and the specific dry winter that El Niño typically delivers. None of those factors on its own is enough to cause catastrophe. Together, they stack. And while the fires build on land, something much harder to see is expanding in the standing water, left behind by floods elsewhere. Something that has historically killed more people than any fire ever has. There is a fact about mosquitoes that most people do not fully reckon with. The mosquito is responsible for more human deaths across recorded history than any other animal, including other humans. Malaria alone kills hundreds of thousands of people every year in the present day. Dengue fever infects hundreds of millions annually. Both diseases are spread by mosquitoes, and both are expanding their range. El Niño is one of the key engines driving that expansion. The connection between El Niño and mosquito-borne disease is temperature and water. mosquitoes breed in standing water. Their breeding cycle, from egg to flying adult, speeds up dramatically in warm conditions. In a cool environment, the cycle takes several weeks. In warm, humid conditions, it can compress to about 1 week. That means more generations per season, more mosquitoes per breeding site, and a faster spread of whatever virus or parasite the mosquito carries. El Niño creates ideal mosquito conditions in 2 different ways. In the regions it floods, standing water accumulates in ways that create enormous new breeding grounds. Urban neighbourhoods with poor drainage become nurseries. Flooded rice paddies, road ditches, rooftop pools, and abandoned containers all produce mosquitoes at scale. In the regions where El Niño brings warmer temperatures without necessarily bringing floods, the warm air expands the geographic zone where mosquitoes can survive year-round. Mosquitoes that carry malaria cannot survive sustained cold. As winters warm, the altitude and latitude zones that were previously too cold for them shrink. Mosquitoes move uphill into highland communities in Africa and South America that had almost no malaria history. They move north into regions of Europe and North America that had largely eliminated the disease. The communities at the expanding edge of this range have the least protection. They have lower rates of immunity because they have had less historical exposure. They have fewer healthcare systems built around diagnosing and treating tropical diseases because those diseases were never supposed to arrive there. Doctors in highland Peru or rural parts of the southern United States may not initially recognize a dengue or malaria case because they have rarely or never seen one. That diagnostic delay costs lives. Malaria in particular, if caught early, responds well to treatment. Caught late, it can cause severe anemia, organ failure, and death. In communities where the disease is new, patients often arrive at a clinic already severely ill because they and their healthcare providers did not recognize the symptoms in time. The 2026 El Niño forecast shows elevated rainfall and temperature anomalies in regions of East Africa, South Asia, and Central America that already carry significant malaria and dengue burden. The conditions during and after the peak of the event are expected to produce expanded breeding seasons, larger mosquito populations, and increased disease transmission rates in these areas. For communities in the flood zones of Western South America, the double exposure is particularly severe. They first face the flooding itself, then the standing water left behind becomes the breeding ground. Then the disease burden hits as the floodwater is still receding. The health system that was partially overwhelmed by the physical flood gets hit again by the disease surge that follows it. A mosquito-borne disease is only one channel. The other moves through the water that people drink. Water looks clean before it kills you. That is the danger with floodwater-borne disease. The contamination is invisible. The water that floods a street, fills a courtyard, or backs up into a neighbourhood drainage system may look murky but otherwise normal. Inside it, bacteria are multiplying. Cholera is caused by a bacterium called Vibrio cholerae. It lives in water. Under normal conditions, it exists in low concentrations in marine and freshwater environments, without causing widespread illness. The problem starts when human waste, which contains the bacterium in large concentrations when someone is already infected, mixes with drinking water. Cities with strong sewage infrastructure keep those two systems separate. Treated water flows to taps. Wastewater flows to treatment plants. The two never mix under normal circumstances. Flooding destroys that separation. When water rises faster than drainage systems can handle, sewage overflows. Waste treatment plants flood and stop operating. The pressure differentials in water distribution pipes reverse, allowing contaminated water to enter the clean water supply. In a severe flood, the infrastructure that keeps drinking water separate from wastewater can fail within hours. Communities downstream from the failure point begin drinking contaminated water, often without knowing it. Cholera has an incubation period of a few hours to 5 days. Symptoms hit suddenly. Severe cases produce rapid, massive fluid loss. Without treatment, a healthy adult can die within hours of symptom onset. With treatment, the survival rate is high. The challenge is delivering treatment fast enough to a large enough number of people in a flooded, partially inaccessible area. The 2026 El Niño flooding threat is most acute in the urban areas of Western South America, Central America, and parts of East Africa. Many of these cities have experienced population growth that outpaced their water and sewage infrastructure investment. They have large low-income neighbourhoods where pipes are older, pressure is inconsistent, and household water storage practices create secondary contamination risks. The track record during past El Niño events in these regions is grim. After the 1997 to 1998 event, cholera cases surged across multiple countries in the affected flood zones. The cases came in waves, first during the floods, then again as floodwaters receded and contaminated soil dried into dust, then again if heavy rains returned and re-wetted the contaminated ground. Beyond cholera, El Niño flooding creates conditions for typhoid, hepatitis A, and a range of other waterborne infections. The common factor is the breakdown of the barrier between human waste and drinking water. In a flood, that barrier fails repeatedly and in multiple places simultaneously. The populations most affected are children under 5 and elderly adults, groups whose immune systems handle rapid fluid loss worst. The burden on already strained hospital and clinic systems can be overwhelming during a major flood event. Clinics that normally serve a few hundred patients per week can receive thousands in a single day following a flood event. International health organizations are already pre-positioning oral rehydration supplies, cholera vaccines, and water purification equipment in the regions most likely to flood during the 2026 El Niño peak. The response planning is happening. Whether it will be fast enough and large enough is the open question. But the disease threat from El Niño does not arrive only through flooding and mosquitoes. One more vector is building offshore, in the warming ocean itself. Offshore, beneath the surface of warming coastal waters, something invisible is growing. It looks like nothing from the surface. Maybe a slight change in colour, a faint greenish or reddish tint spreading across a bay or estuary. People walk past it on piers without a second look. But this growth, called a harmful algal bloom, can poison an entire coastline in days. Algae are naturally present in all aquatic environments. Most species are harmless and form the base of the marine food chain, but certain species, when given the right combination of warm water, sunlight and nutrients, can multiply explosively. A single cell becomes billions within days. The resulting bloom can stretch for miles and persist for weeks. The problem is what these blooms produce. Many harmful algal bloom species generate toxins as a natural byproduct. These toxins accumulate in shellfish like clams, mussels and oysters that filter water for food. The shellfish are not killed by the toxins, they simply accumulate them. A single contaminated oyster can carry enough toxin to cause serious illness in a human. Larger doses can be fatal. El Niño creates ideal conditions for these blooms. Warmer ocean surface temperatures let the algae species that cause harmful blooms outcompete the normal algae. El Niño also shifts currents in ways that bring nutrient-rich deep water closer to the surface in some zones, providing the fertilizer these blooms need to explode in size. Along the western coast of the Americas, coastal communities that depend on shellfish harvesting face these bloom risks directly. During the 1997 to 1998 El Niño, harmful algal bloom events along the coasts of California, Chile and Peru caused significant fishery closures. Commercial shellfish operations lost months of production. Recreational harvesting was banned across large stretches of coastline. Several wild harvesting incidents resulted in severe poisonings. In 2026, the warming of coastal waters began earlier in the year than the historical pattern. Bloom events were already being recorded along the California coast and the coasts of Chile and Peru by mid-spring. Fisheries managers issued harvest closures in multiple areas. The economic impact hit commercial fishermen immediately. Beyond shellfish, large blooms can have broader impacts on marine ecosystems. Some bloom species produce compounds that are toxic to fish, causing mass die-offs in enclosed bays and estuaries. Dead fish washing onto beaches create public health hazards and overwhelm local cleanup capacity. Tourism in affected coastal areas collapses during bloom events. The health risk from algal toxins extends beyond direct consumption. When blooms decompose, they can release toxins that become airborne as sea spray. People walking near affected beaches or living in coastal communities have reported respiratory irritation and other symptoms during major bloom events. Individuals with asthma or other breathing conditions face elevated risks. For communities whose primary protein source and economic livelihood comes from the sea, a prolonged harmful algal bloom season during an El Niño year represents a compounding crisis. The food source disappears, the income disappears, the ocean itself becomes something to avoid rather than depend on. And while the ocean poisons itself along the coast, the sky above the ocean is doing something equally strange. The atmosphere over the Pacific is suppressing hurricanes in one ocean basin, while manufacturing them in another. Hurricane season runs from June through November. Every year, emergency managers from the Gulf Coast to the Caribbean watch the Atlantic with a level of attention that does not fully relax until December. Hurricanes have shaped the history of the American South and the Caribbean in ways that go beyond individual storms. They define infrastructure decisions, insurance markets, and where people choose to build their lives. El Niño rewrites the hurricane playbook, and it does so in two opposite directions at once. In the Atlantic, El Niño acts like a suppression system. The mechanism is called wind shear. Wind shear describes the difference in wind speed and direction between the lower atmosphere and the upper atmosphere. When those two levels of the atmosphere move at very different speeds or in different directions, a developing hurricane gets torn apart. The storm's circulation cannot organize and strengthen because the upper-level winds are constantly disrupting it. El Niño strengthens upper-level winds over the Atlantic basin. This creates a persistent wind shear environment that shreds tropical storms before they can develop into hurricanes. During strong El Niño years, Atlantic hurricane seasons are typically quieter than average. The 1997 El Niño year produced an unusually inactive Atlantic season. Forecasters are anticipating a similar suppression effect for the 2026 Atlantic season. For Gulf Coast residents and Caribbean communities accustomed to watching storm tracks closely, a suppressed Atlantic season might feel like good news. And in the narrow sense of reduced Atlantic hurricane risk, it is. But the same ocean dynamics that calm the Atlantic are doing the opposite in the Pacific. The Central and Eastern Pacific Ocean, warmed far above normal by the El Niño event, becomes a hurricane factory. Warm water provides the energy that fuels tropical cyclones. The same wind shear that suppresses Atlantic storms is largely absent in the Eastern Pacific. The result is a hyperactive Eastern Pacific hurricane season. Hawaii sits directly in the path of this elevated Pacific storm activity. Hawaii rarely faces direct hurricane threats in normal years. The islands sit in a zone that most Pacific storms either miss or weaken before reaching. During strong El Niño events, warmer waters extend further west toward the islands, and storm tracks shift in ways that bring more systems closer. The western coast of Mexico and the Baja California Peninsula face elevated direct hurricane risk from the hyperactive Eastern Pacific season. These areas have infrastructure and emergency systems built around the historical hurricane frequency, which is significantly lower than what El Niño years can produce. There is also a secondary effect from Pacific hurricanes that rarely gets discussed. When a Pacific storm makes landfall in Mexico, or drives moisture toward the American Southwest, it can produce extreme rainfall events in areas that are simultaneously drought-stressed. The combination of parched ground that cannot absorb water and sudden intense rainfall creates flash flooding that can be more deadly per storm than a traditional hurricane making landfall in a well-monitored coastal area. The asymmetry between the two ocean basins is one of the strangest aspects of El Niño. One set of physical conditions, the warm Pacific pool, simultaneously calms one of the most monitored weather zones in the world while energizing another that is less prepared for what it is about to receive. And that same atmospheric asymmetry does not stop at hurricanes. It reaches all the way up to the polar regions, destabilizing a system far above the tropics that most people have never heard of, but which can send winter into places that are completely unprepared for it. Most people picture Hawaii as a paradise that weather leaves alone. Warm sun, calm trade winds, gentle waves. The islands sit far enough out in the Pacific that most storms weaken or veer off before arriving. That picture is accurate in most years. El Niño years are different. When the Central Pacific warms significantly, the zone of warm water that fuels tropical cyclones expands westward. Storms that would normally form and die in the Eastern Pacific, far from land, now have a longer runway of warm water to strengthen over. The track of these storms shifts. Systems that would have turned north and dissipated over open ocean instead hold their course westward, directly toward the Hawaiian Islands. During the 1994 El Niño event, Hurricane Iniki struck the island of Kauai as one of the most powerful storms to hit Hawaii in recorded history. Winds exceeded 140 miles per hour. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. The island took years to rebuild. That event happened during a moderate El Niño. The 2026 event is tracking stronger. Emergency managers across Hawaii began updating their response plans in early 2026. The challenges are specific to the islands. Hawaii is geographically isolated. Supply chains that mainland states take for granted, emergency fuel, food, building materials, medical equipment, all depend on ships and planes arriving on schedule. A major hurricane striking Hawaii does not just damage what it hits, it can sever the supply lines needed for recovery. The island topography adds another layer of danger. Hawaii's volcanic mountains are steep. When a hurricane drives heavy rainfall over those slopes, the water does not soak in or spread out. It channels into fast-moving streams that can turn into walls of water. Flash flooding and mudslides during past storm events have caused deaths in areas that were miles from any coastline. In an El Niño season, this risk extends from a single storm scenario to a multi-storm season. The western coast of Mexico faces a similar elevated risk. The Pacific coast of Jalisco, Colima, and Sinaloa has been hit by strong Pacific hurricanes in past El Niño events. Patricia in 2015, which reached maximum sustained winds of 215 miles per hour, the strongest hurricane ever measured at landfall in the Western Hemisphere, developed during the last major El Niño cycle. The western Mexican coast had just under a day of warning. The Baja California Peninsula and even parts of Southern California face a secondary risk. Moisture from Pacific storms that make landfall in Mexico can stream northward and drop extreme rainfall across desert terrain. Desert soil, baked hard and nearly impermeable after dry years, sheds water rather than absorbing it. Flash floods across the American Southwest linked to Pacific storm remnants have caused deaths in areas that had not seen significant rainfall in months. The communities in the path of a more active Pacific hurricane season were largely built during decades when that season was relatively quiet. Infrastructure was sized for historical storm frequencies. Drainage systems, seawalls, emergency shelters, and evacuation routes reflect a risk level that the 2026 El Niño is pushing well above. Storm intensity is also evolving. As the ocean warms, peak hurricane wind speeds increase. A storm that would have reached Category 3 in 1990 may reach Category 4 or 5 today on the same atmospheric fuel. The warming baseline of the ocean in 2026 means Pacific storms have more raw energy available. Hawaii and the western coast are now watching the horizon in a way they rarely have before, and while they scan for storms offshore, something else is unraveling in the atmosphere directly above the continental United States. Most passengers experience turbulence as an inconvenience. The seatbelt sign comes on, drinks get spilled, a few people grip their armrests, then it passes. What most passengers do not realize is that the severity and frequency of turbulence over North America is changing, and El Niño is one of the forces pushing it. Turbulence comes in several forms. The kind most people have experienced is associated with visible weather, thunderstorms, clouds, mountain waves. Pilots see these systems on radar and can route around them. The far more unpredictable kind is called clear air turbulence. It happens in perfectly clear skies, at cruising altitude, with no visible warning on any instrument. It strikes without a second of notice. Clear air turbulence forms at the edges of the jet stream, where fast-moving high-altitude air meets slower-moving air alongside it. The boundary between these two masses creates turbulent mixing. Aircraft crossing that boundary, especially at high speed, can experience sudden and violent jolts. El Niño strengthens and shifts the jet stream over North America. A stronger, more southerly jet stream means a more energetic boundary zone. More energetic boundaries mean more clear air turbulence more frequently across a wider geographic area. Researchers studying the relationship between climate patterns and flight turbulence have documented a long-term increase in severe, clear air turbulence events over the North Atlantic and North American flight corridors. The 2026 El Niño is expected to produce a particularly active turbulence season for transcontinental routes, especially those crossing the central and eastern United States at typical cruising altitudes. For passengers, the primary risk from unexpected turbulence is injury. Flight attendants working in the aisle and passengers not wearing seatbelts are most vulnerable. Aviation safety data shows that turbulence injuries are the most common cause of non-fatal serious injuries in commercial aviation. During a strong turbulence event, unsecured objects become projectiles. Overhead bin contents can burst loose. A sudden severe jolt with no warning can throw a standing person against the cabin ceiling. Airlines respond to El Niño turbulence seasons in several ways. Flight dispatch teams route flights to avoid the most active shear zones when possible. This can add flight time and fuel costs to routes that normally fly more directly. During particularly active periods, cabin crew are instructed to stay seated more frequently, limiting in-flight service. For the aviation industry, the economic impact of El Niño turbulence is measurable. Rerouting adds fuel burn. Turbulence-related injuries generate liability costs. Aircraft that experience severe turbulence events require inspection before returning to service. When multiple aircraft across a fleet require post-turbulence inspection simultaneously, scheduling complications ripple across an entire airline's network. Passengers who fly regularly across the United States and North Atlantic during the 2026 to 2027 El Niño season should expect a rougher ride than average. The seatbelt sign may stay on longer. Flights may take slightly different routes than the direct path between cities. The delays and discomfort are minor compared to what El Niño is doing on the ground. But El Niño's reach into the sky does not stop at turbulence. Far above the jet stream, in the stratosphere over the Arctic, another system is being destabilized, and when it breaks, it sends winter southward in a direction and intensity that modern heating systems and road networks were never designed to handle. High above the Arctic, circling the North Pole at the edge of the stratosphere, a massive cylinder of cold air spins continuously. It is called the polar vortex. Under normal conditions, it stays locked in place by a strong band of winds that circle it and keep the Arctic cold where it belongs. When that spinning system stays intact, winters in the continental United States are predictable. Cold air stays north. The south stays mild. Snow falls where snow normally falls. When the polar vortex destabilizes, the cold air escapes. El Niño disrupts the polar vortex indirectly but powerfully. The warm Pacific air that El Niño pumps into the atmosphere changes the pressure and temperature patterns across the northern hemisphere in ways that weaken the stratospheric winds holding the vortex together. When those winds weaken, the vortex wobbles, stretches, and sometimes splits. Cold Arctic air that should stay north pours south in massive surges. The result is what meteorologists call a sudden stratospheric warming event, followed weeks later by an outbreak of extreme cold air across unexpected parts of the northern hemisphere. Parts of the southern United States, including Texas, Louisiana, and the Gulf Coast, which have heating infrastructure built for mild winters, can experience temperatures that drop to single digits Fahrenheit or below. The 2021 Texas freeze offers the clearest recent example of what polar vortex disruption can cause. A polar vortex weakening brought temperatures across Texas to extremes the state's energy grid was never designed to withstand. Power plants failed. Water pipes froze and burst. Over 200 people died from hypothermia and related causes. The economic damage reached over $100 billion. That event happened without a major El Niño. The 2026 El Niño creates the atmospheric conditions that historically precede polar vortex disruptions. This does not mean a Texas-scale event is guaranteed, but it places the risk at significantly elevated levels. The counterintuitive part of this story is the timing. El Niño brings warmer average winters to the northern United States and Canada. The Pacific Northwest runs above average temperature. The Great Lakes see less snow. From the outside, an El Niño winter looks warmer. But hidden inside that warmer average are the conditions for brief, extreme cold outbreaks that can be more dangerous precisely because the infrastructure and population were not prepared for them. A city that averages a mild winter invests less in salt trucks, pipe insulation, backup heating systems, and cold weather emergency response. When the cold arrives unexpectedly and at extreme levels, the entire system is caught off guard. Emergency planners in the Gulf South are well aware of this risk after 2021. Several states have made infrastructure improvements specifically aimed at preventing a repeat. But the scale of what would be needed to fully winterproof infrastructure built for a subtropical climate is enormous. The work that has been done since 2021 addresses some of the vulnerability. Whether it is enough depends on how severe the polar vortex disruption turns out to be, and that answer will not be known until the pattern locks in during the late fall or early winter. But the polar vortex is only one end of the atmospheric disruption. At the other end, in the tropical Pacific where the heat all started, the ocean is doing something that scientists have never seen in quite this combination before. The Pacific and Atlantic Oceans are not equal partners in driving global weather. They compete. The warmer one wins more influence over the global atmosphere, and right now the Pacific is dominating in a way that reshapes the rules. Under normal conditions, the Atlantic and Pacific both contribute to global weather patterns. The Atlantic drives much of the weather affecting Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Americas. The Pacific drives weather for Asia, the Western Americas, Australia, and a large share of the tropics. The two systems interact but maintain a rough balance. El Niño breaks that balance. When the Central Pacific heats dramatically, it pumps an enormous amount of energy into the atmosphere. That energy injection is so large that it effectively competes with and overrides the Atlantic's normal weather influence. The Pacific becomes the dominant driver of global atmospheric circulation. The consequences reach into regions that feel far removed from the tropical Pacific. The Indian Ocean monsoon weakens because the Pacific draws moisture and atmospheric energy away from the Indian Ocean system. Sub-Saharan Africa sees shifts in its rainy seasons. The Mediterranean experiences altered storm tracks. Even Western Europe can see winter weather anomalies linked to Pacific dominance. For the Atlantic specifically, the competition plays out in hurricane dynamics, as the previous chapter covered, but also in ocean temperature patterns. A dominant Pacific El Niño changes the pattern of heat exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere globally, which can temporarily suppress or redirect heat in the Atlantic. This creates a situation where the two most important ocean basins on Earth are operating in different modes simultaneously. The significance for 2026 is amplified by the warming baseline. In past El Niño events, the Pacific warmed above a cooler global baseline. The warming signal was still dramatic against that background. In 2026, the Pacific is warming above a global ocean temperature that is already the warmest on record. The competition between oceans is happening at an entirely new temperature level. Scientists who study ocean atmosphere interactions describe this as moving into uncharted territory. The historical record of El Niño events provides a framework, but the specific combination of a strong El Niño on top of record warm global ocean temperatures has no direct past parallel. Model projections offer guidance, but the confidence intervals, meaning the range of possible outcomes, are wider than usual because the system is operating outside the conditions it was calibrated against. What is confirmed is that Pacific dominance during a strong El Niño reshapes weather on every continent. The question researchers are actively working on is whether that reshaping in 2026, happening at a new baseline, produces outcomes proportionally more extreme than past events. The preliminary answer from most models is yes, more extreme, more persistent, more geographically widespread. And that escalation shows up not just in weather data, but in shipping lanes, cargo delays, and the supply chains that move the products billions of people depend on every day. Every product that travels between continents moves by ship. The electronics in your pocket, the clothes on your back, the fuel in a gas station, the grain in a warehouse. 90% of global trade moves across the ocean, and the routes those ships travel are not fixed forever. They follow the weather. El Niño shifts storm tracks. It intensifies certain weather systems while calming others. It alters the zones of high wind and rough seas that cargo ships try to avoid, and it disrupts the predictable routing assumptions that global supply chains are built around. The most direct disruption comes through port operations. Major ports in the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and other Pacific nations regularly suspend or limit operations during severe weather events. A port closure that lasts 3 days does not just delay the ships that were scheduled to dock during those 3 days. It creates a queue. Ships pile up waiting for access. The delay cascades down the shipping lane, affecting ports and receivers thousands of miles away. During the 1997 to 1998 El Niño, shipping disruptions across the Pacific added significant delays and costs to trade between Asia and the Americas. Container shipping lines had to adjust routes, adding transit days. Perishable cargo missed delivery windows. Manufacturers waiting for parts from overseas suppliers faced production halts. The 2026 El Niño arrives in a global shipping industry that has not fully recovered from previous disruptions. Container costs spiked dramatically during the pandemic supply chain crisis and have remained above their historical averages. Port labour costs have risen. Shipping capacity is tighter than in the early 2000s. The buffer that used to absorb moderate disruptions is thinner. Aviation routes over the North Pacific and North America also face disruption from the shifted jet stream. Commercial freight that moves by air, which includes high-value electronics, pharmaceuticals, and time-sensitive cargo, faces the same route adjustments and turbulence risks as passenger flights. Air freight costs rise when routes must detour around severe weather zones. One specific shipping vulnerability during El Niño years is the Panama Canal. The canal depends on fresh water from Gatun Lake to operate its locks. El Niño drought conditions in Central America reduce rainfall across the canal watershed. In 2023, a drought linked to El Niño conditions forced the Panama Canal Authority to restrict the draft, meaning the depth of ships transiting the canal. Larger ships could not pass fully loaded. Some cargo was redistributed to smaller vessels or rerouted around South America, adding thousands of miles to journeys. The 2026 El Niño is forecast to bring drought conditions to Central America at least as severe as 2023. Canal operators have already begun managing water levels proactively, but if rainfall deficits reach the levels forecasters project, restrictions will return. Every day of draft restrictions at the Panama Canal affects hundreds of ships and millions of tons of cargo. The downstream effect on consumers is usually invisible until suddenly it is not. A product that was available last month is out of stock. A price that was steady for years jumps without obvious explanation. The global supply chain is resilient to a point. El Niño in 2026 is testing where that point actually is, and the most immediate test of that resilience is already playing out in government purchasing departments across Asia, where officials are trying to answer one question before the harvest numbers arrive. When a government calculates that its domestic rice harvest will fall short by hundreds of thousands of tons, it does one thing immediately. It calls its trading partners and asks to buy more. Fast, before the shortage becomes visible in markets, before prices spike, before citizens notice empty shelves. This scramble is already happening across Asia in 2026. And the race is made harder by the fact that every major rice-producing nation in the El Niño drought zone is making the same calls at the same time. The global rice market is surprisingly small relative to the amount of rice consumed worldwide. Most countries that grow rice also consume most of what they grow domestically. The international rice trade represents only around 8% of global production. This means that even modest disruptions to exporting nations cause disproportionate price swings in the import market. The largest rice exporters, India, Thailand, Vietnam, and Pakistan, all sit in climate zones affected by the 2026 El Niño. India, which accounts for roughly 40% of global rice exports, imposed export restrictions during the 2023 food stress period. Any repeat of those restrictions during the 2026 El Niño peak would remove the single largest supply source from the international market, precisely when demand is highest. Countries that depend on rice imports, including many in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and the Caribbean, would face a market where supply has dropped and every buyer is competing simultaneously. Prices in that scenario do not rise gradually, they spike. Buyers who can afford to pay the new price get supply, buyers who cannot get nothing. The ability to move fast matters enormously. Governments that secured long-term supply contracts before the El Niño forecast materialized are in a stronger position. Countries that waited to see how bad the season actually became are now entering a tight market late, with fewer options and higher prices. Emergency food assistance organizations monitor this dynamic closely. The World Food Programme bases much of its annual purchasing on price forecasts. When prices spike unexpectedly during a major El Niño year, the organization's purchasing power decreases even if its budget stays the same. The same amount of money buys less food. The number of people it can feed shrinks. Program managers face the painful arithmetic of deciding which regions get reduced allocations. For individual governments, the political pressure during a rice price spike is severe. Rice is the most politically sensitive food commodity across Asia. Citizens track rice prices the way Americans track gasoline prices. A government that allows staple food prices to double or triple faces serious unrest. Subsidizing prices requires spending reserves that may already be stretched. Allowing prices to rise requires absorbing the political consequences. The Philippines faces this calculation directly. With a projected production drop that could reach 700,000 metric tons, the government has already begun emergency procurement negotiations with multiple trading partners. The early action helps, but it does not eliminate the vulnerability. It manages it. And the Philippine story is not unique. It is the clearest example of something happening simultaneously across a dozen countries, each trying to solve the same math problem against the same clock, with insufficient resources and a market that gets tighter every week. The specific numbers behind the Philippine crisis deserve their own examination, because the way one nation responds to this pressure reveals the entire structure of how El Niño translates, from an ocean temperature reading into a child going hungry. The Philippines grows rice across millions of acres of lowland paddies, terraced hillsides and irrigated plains. The staple is cultural as much as agricultural. A Filipino meal without rice is unusual. The country's identity is partly built around rice farming, and its rural economy depends on it. The El Niño drought pattern lands on the Philippines in a specific and damaging way. The archipelago sits in the Western Pacific, the zone that loses its warm water and its rainfall during El Niño. The rains that normally sustain 2 full cropping seasons per year fall shorter. Irrigation systems that depend on consistent rainfall to recharge draw down faster than they refill. The projection from the Philippine Department of Agriculture for 2026 is a potential loss of up to 700,000 metric tons of rice compared to a normal year. That number is not abstract. It represents roughly 12 million people's annual rice supply, gone from the domestic food chain. Where does the missing rice come from? The government has 2 options. It can release rice from the National Food Authority reserves, the government stockpile built specifically for supply emergencies, or it can buy on the international market. The reserves have limits. They were built to buffer the country through one bad season. A strong El Niño creates conditions that last over a year. If the drought suppresses 2 consecutive cropping seasons, the reserve buffer runs low before the domestic harvest recovers. The international market option comes with a price risk described in the previous chapter. The Philippines is the world's largest rice importer in many years. It is an enormous buyer in a small market. When it enters to purchase emergency supplies at scale, its presence alone moves prices. The country effectively bids against itself, pushing up the price of the rice it needs to buy. For Filipino families, the price signal arrives at the market stall. A kilo of rice that cost 45 pesos in 2025 climbs towards 60 or 70 during an El Niño supply crunch. For a family earning minimum wage in Manila, a 40% increase in rice prices changes the entire household budget. Rice is not a discretionary expense. It is consumed every day, by every family member, at every meal. Nutritional impacts follow. When families stretch their rice budget, they reduce the diversity of what they eat alongside the rice. Vegetables, fish, and protein sources get cut first. The diet simplifies. In children under 5, whose brains and bodies are still developing, prolonged nutritional simplification causes measurable developmental damage. In infants dependent on mothers who are not eating enough, the harm begins even earlier. The government's response involves multiple tracks simultaneously. Price controls or subsidies on rice sold at government-operated retail stores, acceleration of drought-resistant seed programs for farmers who can still plant, water rationing coordination with the National Irrigation Administration to extend the water that remains, public communication campaigns to reduce waste. Each of these responses costs money. The government enters this crisis with a budget that was already managing infrastructure debt, post-typhoon recovery, and pandemic-era economic recovery spending. The fiscal space available to respond is real but finite. The Philippines is managing its crisis with competence and speed. The underlying problem is that the resources required to fully buffer a super El Niño are larger than any single mid-income nation can hold in reserve. The system cracks even when the response is good. And above all these specific crises, a threshold in global temperature is approaching that changes the context for every disaster that follows it. Every few years, a headline announces that the past year was the hottest in recorded history. The statement has become so common that it has started to feel routine. A number announced, some alarm expressed, then the next story arrives and the number is absorbed into the background. The 2026 or 2027 calendar year is likely to claim this record. Scientists at multiple climate agencies have placed high probability on this outcome. And unlike past record years, this one comes with a specific driver, the combination of El Niño heat release on top of a global temperature baseline that has already climbed nearly 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit above where it was a century ago. Understanding what a record global temperature year actually means requires stepping back from the annual number and thinking about what temperature does at scale. Global average temperature is not a number most people feel in their daily life. A single day in your city can be 20 degrees above or below what the global annual average turns out to be. The global number is an average across every ocean surface, every land mass, every atmospheric layer on Earth, measured and compiled over 12 months. It is the summary statistic of a planetary system. When that summary statistic rises by even a fraction of a degree, the physical implications are enormous. The planet's oceans store heat. A global temperature record means those oceans absorbed more heat than in any previous year. That extra heat does not disappear. It sits in the water, raising sea levels as water expands, intensifying storms that draw energy from ocean surface temperature and accelerating ice melt at the poles. The heat record also means extreme weather thresholds get crossed more frequently. Every additional fraction of a degree of baseline warming adds more days per year, where temperatures in vulnerable regions exceed the thresholds for heat-related illness and death. Agricultural zones experience more days where temperatures are above the range, where crops can grow and reproduce. Coral reefs experience more weeks of water temperature above the level that triggers bleaching and death. The 2026 record year, if it materializes, will be the first in which global warming's background heat and a major El Niño's temporary heat spike combine at this magnitude. The previous record years, 2016 and 2023, both involved El Niño contributions, but the baseline those spikes lifted off was lower than it is today. The spike in 2026 or 2027 launches from a higher floor. For the people living through it, a record year means more consecutive days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit across large parts of the tropics and subtropics. It means nights that do not cool down, removing the recovery window that allows human bodies to survive intense daytime heat. It means humid heat that sweat cannot counteract, pushing apparent temperatures past what the human body can manage outdoors. Heat kills quietly. It does not produce the dramatic imagery of a flood or a fire. People die indoors, in cities where temperatures stay above 95 degrees for multiple consecutive nights. Elderly people and outdoor workers are most vulnerable. The deaths show up in mortality statistics weeks after the event, counted as excess deaths above the seasonal average. The record will be announced, the implications will be documented, and then the world will keep warming toward the next one. But before any record is broken, a specific line in the temperature data has already been crossed, and crossing it changes what every future climate event is measured against. At the Paris Climate Summit in 2015, nations agreed to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The number was chosen carefully. Scientists had analysed the difference in climate impacts between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming, and found that keeping to the lower threshold would prevent a significant number of catastrophic outcomes. More coral reef survival, fewer extreme heat events, less sea level rise, less agricultural disruption. 1.5 degrees Celsius is about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. It sounds small. A 2-degree temperature swing happens on an ordinary morning when the sun comes up. At a planetary scale, the physics of that shift are enormous. The planet's average temperature has already climbed to approximately 1.45 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels as of the data available before the 2026 El Niño fully peaked. The El Niño event, by pumping heat from the Pacific Ocean into the atmosphere, is expected to push the 12-month average temperature above 1.5 degrees for a sustained period. Exceeding this threshold temporarily during an El Niño event is different from permanently crossing it. Scientists distinguish between a temporary El Niño-assisted exceedance and a structural long-term crossing. The Paris threshold was intended as a long-term average, not a single-year value, year. But the temporary crossing matters in ways that extend beyond symbolism. Every time global temperatures spike above 1.5 degrees, even briefly, systems that operate near their temperature tolerance limits get pushed over the edge. Coral reefs, which have already lost significant coverage globally, experience bleaching events at temperatures just fractions of a degree above what they have already survived. A temporary spike above 1.5 degrees during 2026 to 2027 will trigger bleaching events across reef systems that are still recovering from the last major bleaching cycle. Ice sheets respond to temperature spikes with melt events that are not fully reversible when temperatures temporarily ease back. The ice that melts during a record warm year does not all return the following winter. Each cycle of record warmth followed by slightly less warm cooling leaves a net deficit. The 1.5 degree line also matters for agricultural systems. Many crop varieties were developed and are currently planted based on historical temperature averages. Above certain thresholds, the chemical processes inside a plant that convert sunlight and nutrients into grain begin to break down. Sustained temperatures above those thresholds during the growing season reduce yields even when water is available. The political significance of the threshold being crossed, even temporarily, is also real. Nations that agreed to the Paris targets understood them as hard limits. Governments in vulnerable island nations and low-lying coastal countries argued strenuously for the 1.5 number specifically because their survival scenarios depend on whether that threshold is held. Seeing it exceeded, even briefly, shifts the terms of international climate negotiations. The line is being crossed in 2026. The crossing has physical consequences that will outlast the El Niño event that pushed it over. And those consequences stack on top of a planet that was already carrying more warmth than at any point in human civilization. The stacking effect is not metaphor, it has a specific scientific mechanism, and that mechanism is what makes 2026's El Niño fundamentally different from every strong El Niño that came before it. A weather event does not exist in isolation. It exists on top of whatever the world looked like before it arrived. A house fire is more destructive if the house was already dry and weakened before the flame touched it. A flood does more damage if the soil was already saturated. A virus spreads faster in a population with a compromised immune system. The condition of the system before the shock determines how much damage the shock causes. The 2026 El Niño arrived on a planet carrying roughly 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit of extra warmth compared to the world that experienced the devastating 1997 to 1998 El Niño. That number sounds minor, The physical consequences are not. The extra warmth means ocean surfaces across the world, not just in the El Niño zone, are running warmer than they were during previous events. Warmer oceans evaporate more water. More water vapour in the atmosphere means that when a storm forms, it has more moisture to work with. Rain events produce more rainfall per storm. The standard comparison is that for every degree of warming, the atmosphere can hold about 7% more water vapour. Over 1.5 degrees means roughly 10% more moisture available per storm system than in the mid-20th century. 10% more rainfall sounds modest. In a city with drainage designed for historical rainfall rates, 10% more can overwhelm the entire system. The pipes, the channels, the retention ponds, all were sized for historical norms. When those norms shift, the infrastructure fails. The warming amplifier also operates through soil and vegetation. The extra heat of recent decades has dried out soils across drought-prone regions to a degree that is measurable in satellite data. Drier soils mean less moisture available to moderate temperature extremes. Less moisture means hotter heat waves. It also means more flammable vegetation. Each additional fraction of a degree of background warming adds to the fuel load available for wildfire. For disease spread, the warming amplifier lengthens seasons. Mosquitoes that carry dengue and malaria expand their active season as temperatures rise. A species that previously went dormant in October because nights cooled below a survival threshold may now stay active through November, December, or longer. Each extra week of activity is weeks of additional disease transmission. The critical point is that all of these amplifications happen simultaneously during the 2026 El Niño. The flood is worse because of extra atmospheric moisture. The drought is worse because of already depleted soil water. The fire is worse because of drier vegetation. The disease burden is worse because of the extended mosquito season. Each disaster is not 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit worse than its historical counterpart. It is worse along multiple dimensions at once. El Niño has always been the most powerful short-term climate disruptor on Earth. It shook civilizations in the pre-industrial era. It caused famines during the colonial period. It killed hundreds of thousands during events in the 1970s and 1980s, and it did all of that on a cooler planet than the one it is operating on now. What scientists are watching in 2026 is the first major El Niño event fully inside the era of measurable climate change amplification. The historical playbook describes what El Niño does. It was written before the amplifier was turned up this high. Understanding that the playbook no longer fully applies is exactly why the uncertainty around 2026 is so large. And that uncertainty is not a comfort. It is a warning. Weather forecasting is one of the greatest scientific achievements of the last century. The ability to predict a hurricane's track 5 days in advance, to forecast a blizzard a week ahead, to model rainfall patterns months into the future, all of this came from decades of data collection, modelling advances and hard-won scientific understanding. El Niño forecasting is among the more sophisticated branches of climate prediction. Scientists can now detect the early signals of a developing event months before it affects weather patterns. They can project general seasonal impacts with meaningful accuracy. The 2026 event has been on their radar since late 2025. But predicting the exact peak intensity of an El Niño event remains genuinely difficult. And the 2026 event adds layers of uncertainty that make the challenge greater than in previous cycles. The core problem is that El Niño peak intensity depends on feedback loops between the ocean and the atmosphere that are sensitive to initial conditions in ways that compound over time. Small differences in the state of the ocean in March become larger differences in the state of the atmosphere by August. Those differences cascade into meaningfully different outcomes by December. Computer models run by weather agencies around the world disagree on the 2026 peak. Some show a super El Niño, meaning sea surface temperature anomalies exceeding 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. Others show a strong El Niño that peaks just below that threshold. The range between these outcomes corresponds to significant differences in expected impacts, particularly for rainfall in Southeast Asia and drought severity in the Amazon. The warming baseline adds uncertainty in a specific way. Past El Niño events were calibrated against a cooler ocean. The equations that describe how ocean heat transfers to the atmosphere and how that transfer affects weather were derived from observations made during decades when ocean and atmospheric temperatures were lower than they are now. Applying those equations in a warmer world assumes that the relationships hold at higher baseline temperatures. Most scientists believe they do, generally. But the precise behaviour of the system at these new temperature levels is not fully characterised. The practical implication of this uncertainty is that emergency planners must prepare for a range of outcomes rather than a single projected scenario. A region that plans for a moderate El Niño and receives a super El Niño is caught underprepared. A region that prepares for a super event and receives a moderate one has spent resources that could have gone elsewhere. Neither outcome is ideal. Planning under genuine uncertainty is expensive and imperfect. For the public, this uncertainty manifests as forecasts with wide error bars, statements about probability ranges rather than definite outcomes, and official communications that try to convey both urgency and appropriate hedging. These communications are often misread as scientists being unsure whether to be worried. The scientists are worried. The uncertainty is about magnitude, not direction. The direction is clear. A strong El Niño is coming. It is developing on a planet running hotter than any previous strong El Niño has encountered. Its impacts will be serious and widespread. The debate is over how serious and how widespread. That debate is happening in real time among researchers doing some of the most important science of the current era. And while they work toward better answers, governments are relying on a different kind of calculation entirely. Every major grain-producing and importing nation maintains a strategic food reserve. These are physical stockpiles of rice, wheat, corn, and other staples held in government warehouses, silos, and storage facilities. They exist specifically to buffer supply disruptions. When a harvest fails, the reserve releases grain to markets. Prices stabilise, shortages are prevented. The concept works well for localised crises. One country has a bad harvest. It draws from its reserve while importing replacement grain from elsewhere. Within 1 or 2 seasons, the reserve is rebuilt. The system holds. A synchronized global El Niño stresses this model near its limits. The reserve system was designed around the assumption that when some regions fail, others will be producing normally and available to supply the deficit. During a major El Niño event, that assumption breaks down across multiple major producing regions simultaneously. Global grain reserves as a share of annual consumption have fluctuated over the decades. They reached dangerously low levels during the 2007 to 2008 food price crisis, when a combination of poor harvests, rising energy prices, and export restrictions caused global food prices to spike dramatically, triggering riots in over 30 countries. After that crisis, there was significant international focus on rebuilding buffer stocks. Current reserve levels entering the 2026 El Niño are moderate. They are higher than the dangerous lows of 2008, but lower than the comfortable highs of the mid-2000s. The buffer that exists is real but not large. The critical test is duration. Reserves are sized to handle supply disruptions measured in months. The 2026 El Niño is forecast to peak from late 2026 through early 2027 and will affect agricultural seasons across multiple consecutive planting cycles. If drought suppresses rice and wheat harvests in Asia during the 2026 main season and then continues to stress the 2027 early planting season, the reserve buffer faces a drawdown that extends beyond what it was built for. The countries with the largest reserves relative to their consumption, China, India, and the United States, are in the strongest position to protect their own populations. China, which holds enormous grain stockpiles, is expected to largely shield its domestic market from global price spikes through strategic reserve management. Countries without those stockpiles face a harder calculation. Several nations in West Africa, the Horn of Africa, and Central America hold reserves covering fewer than 45 days of consumption. 45 days of buffer against a disruption that could last over a year is a narrow margin. International reserve sharing mechanisms exist on paper. The Food and Agriculture Organization coordinates monitoring and some emergency response capacity. But actual physical reserve sharing between nations during a crisis is slow, expensive, and politically complicated. Countries facing domestic pressure to protect their own food supply are reluctant to export grain even to allies in need. The reserve system is a lifeline. In 2026, it is a lifeline being tested by the scale of the stress it was built to withstand. Whether it holds, frays, or partially breaks will determine the humanitarian outcome of this El Niño more than almost any other single factor, and the speed with which reserves are tested depends heavily on how fast the physical disasters unfold, because in flood zones the clock does not wait. A city's infrastructure is a system of systems. Water pipes connect to sewage lines, connect to drainage channels, connect to river management structures, connect to roads that emergency vehicles travel, connect to power lines that run the pumps that keep the whole network functioning. Each component depends on the others. Flood engineering is built around historical storm data. Engineers calculate the maximum rainfall rate the region has historically produced and design drainage, levees, and retention systems to handle that maximum with some safety margin added. The system is robust against the historical worst case. El Niño does not respect the historical worst case. It rewrites it. When rainfall rates exceed design capacity, the failure cascade begins. Drainage systems reach their capacity and overflow. Water that should be channeled away spreads across streets and into buildings. Storm drains run backwards. The pressure differentials created by flooding can push water up through toilets, floor drains, and low-lying pipes into buildings that appear sealed from outside entry. Power infrastructure is typically the first major system to fail. Substations flooded lose the ability to distribute power. A single substation failure can take out power for tens of thousands of customers. Without power, the pumps that keep drainage systems moving stop. Water rises faster. Without power, hospitals switch to generators that have limited fuel. Without power, the communication systems that coordinate emergency response degrade. The speed of infrastructure failure during a major flood event is the most counterintuitive aspect for people who have not experienced one. A neighbourhood that was dry at midnight can be under 2 feet of water by 6 in the morning. Residents who went to sleep in a functioning city wake up in a crisis. Emergency services that were prepared for their usual call volume face simultaneous emergencies across an entire urban zone. Road damage from flooding is rapid and comprehensive. Roads built on subsoil that get saturated can experience what engineers call liquefaction, where the ground temporarily loses structural strength and essentially behaves like a liquid. Pavement cracks, shifts, and collapses. Roads that appear intact on the surface may have undermined foundations that cause them to collapse under vehicle weight. Emergency vehicles attempting to reach flood victims destroy the road further. The restoration timeline after severe flood infrastructure damage is measured in months, sometimes years. Repairing buried pipe systems requires excavating flooded streets. Restoring power substations in flood-prone areas requires drying, inspecting, and often replacing sophisticated electrical equipment. Rebuilding road foundations requires draining, drying, and stabilizing subsoil before new material can be laid. During the recovery period, the community operates in a degraded state. Boil water advisories remain in effect for months while pipe systems are inspected and cleared. Neighbourhoods without power rely on generators. Access roads remain restricted. Economic activity in the affected zone essentially halts. For cities that experience this during the 2026 El Niño peak flooding period, the infrastructure collapse is the beginning of a multi-year recovery arc, not a single crisis to survive. Resources that should go toward building resilience against the next event go toward recovering from this one. And as the physical recovery begins, the second wave of the disaster is quietly arriving in the form of illness. The flood leaves behind conditions that are, in some ways, more dangerous than the flood itself. When the floodwaters recede, the visible crisis ends on the news. Rescue boats come in, cleanup begins, the dramatic images cycle out of the coverage. The world moves on to the next story. But for the people in the flood zone, the crisis has entered its second phase, and the second phase kills people quietly, in numbers that often exceed the deaths from the flood itself. Floodwater is not just water. It is a mixture of runoff from roads, agricultural land, industrial sites, and sewage systems. It picks up fuel residue, pesticides, heavy metals, and biological waste as it moves. When it recedes, it leaves all of these contaminants behind. They dry into dust, soak into soil, and settle into the sediment of contaminated wells and water sources. The first wave of post-flood illness comes from contaminated water. Even after floodwaters recede, water distribution infrastructure remains compromised. Pipes that were flooded carry residual contamination. Wells that were inundated may test positive for bacteria for weeks or months. Residents who return to homes often use water sources they believe have cleared before testing confirms they're safe. Cholera and other waterborne diseases peak not during the flood, but in the 2 to 6 weeks following it. This is the window where health surveillance needs to be most intense, and where treatment resources need to be pre-positioned. Historically, this window is exactly when international attention has moved on, and when local health systems are most exhausted from the initial response. The second wave comes from mosquitoes. Standing water left by floods does not disappear immediately. It collects in low areas, in damaged structures, in containers and debris. Mosquito eggs laid in this water begin hatching within days. The population of mosquitoes in a recently flooded area can explode within 2 weeks of the water receding. Disease transmission from malaria and dengue follows the population spike by another 2 to 3 weeks. The third wave comes from mold and respiratory exposure. Buildings saturated with floodwater develop mold growth within 48 to 72 hours if not dried properly. Many residents in flood-affected areas lack the resources to properly dry and remediate their homes. They return to living in mouldy structures because they have no alternative. Prolonged mold exposure causes respiratory illness, particularly in children and the elderly. For public health systems already taxed by the initial flood emergency, managing 3 overlapping disease waves over a 2 to 3 month period after the flood is an enormous strain. Staff who worked double shifts during the flood continue working elevated hours during the disease surge. Supplies of rehydration salts, anti-malarial drugs and antibiotics that were positioned for the flood response get consumed and need replenishment. The communities that recover fastest from the post-flood disease burden are those with the strongest baseline health infrastructure. Good surveillance systems catch outbreaks early. Adequate drug supply controls them before they spread widely. Strong community health worker networks reach households that cannot access clinics. The communities with the weakest baseline infrastructure suffer the longest. And in the places that El Niño is hitting hardest in 2026, the baseline is already thin. The health crisis from this El Niño will extend well into 2027. The economic cost of that extended crisis adds to the financial burden that governments must manage after the physical event ends. And that economic math, the cost of rebuilding a society after a super El Niño, is a calculation that few governments are fully prepared to run. Disasters have 2 price tags. The first is the cost of the damage. The second is the cost of the recovery. The first is what makes headlines. The second is what breaks governments. Infrastructure repair following a major El Niño event is expensive. Roads, water systems, bridges, power grids, public buildings, and irrigation networks all require rebuilding or major repair after severe flooding, drought damage, or fire. The bill for physical infrastructure restoration after a major El Niño year can run into tens of billions of dollars across the affected countries combined. Agricultural recovery adds another enormous line item. Farmers who lost a full growing season do not simply plant again next month and recover. Their seed supplies were consumed or destroyed. Their equipment may be damaged. Their credit lines, often drawn down to cover input costs before the harvest that never came, are maxed out. Replanting requires new capital that many smallholder farmers simply do not have access to. Governments typically respond to agricultural collapse by offering subsidised seeds, low-interest recovery loans, and emergency food transfers. All of these cost money. In countries where the agricultural sector represents a large share of the economy, a single bad El Niño year can subtract multiple percentage points from national economic output. That reduction in output means reduced tax revenue precisely when emergency spending is at its highest. Healthcare costs from the disease burden compound over years. Treating cholera, malaria, and dengue fever creates direct costs. The downstream costs of malnutrition in children, developmental delays, reduced school performance, and eventual reduced economic productivity stretch decades into the future. Economists who study the long-term costs of major famines and food crises find economic impacts that remain measurable in regional data 30 to 40 years after the event. Disaster recovery also competes with investment in resilience. A government that spends its limited capital rebuilding what was destroyed has less available to build back better. The flood wall that would have prevented this year's damage does not get built because all funds went to repairing damage from last year's flood. For wealthy nations, the recovery math is painful but manageable. The United States spends tens of billions on disaster recovery most years and absorbs the cost within a large economy with deep credit markets. The recovery from California wildfires, Gulf Coast storms, and Midwest floods happens within a framework of federal disaster assistance, private insurance, and municipal borrowing capacity. For lower-income nations, the math is different. Countries that lack federal disaster assistance systems, where private insurance penetration is low and municipal borrowing capacity is constrained, face recovery costs that can represent a significant fraction of their entire gross domestic product. They take on international debt to fund recovery. That debt carries interest. Debt service consumes future government revenue. The economic consequence of the disaster outlasts the disaster by decades. The 2026 El Niño is expected to produce recovery costs across the affected regions that rank among the highest in the event's history. The physical scale of impacts, the multiple continent simultaneity, the amplification from background warming, and the already stressed financial positions of many vulnerable countries all push the total bill upward. Paying that bill requires international cooperation at a scale that has rarely been achieved consistently. And after the bills are paid and the rebuilding is underway, the world will face a landscape that is measurably different from the one that existed before this event began. Every strong El Niño ends, the trade winds rebuild, the warm water sloshes back west, the jet stream returns to something closer to its normal path, the rain comes back to places that were dry, and the flooding zones dry out. The immediate disruption fades, but the world that comes out the other side is different from the world that went in. The forests that burned during the 2026 peak season do not return quickly. Tropical forests, including sections of the Amazon that burned through, take decades to grow back to the structural complexity and ecological density that makes them function as forests rather than as degraded scrubland. The species that lived in burned areas and required intact canopy to survive do not return until the canopy does. Some do not return at all. Coral reefs that bleached during the record temperatures of 2026 to 2027 face a years-long recovery window, assuming ocean temperatures ease enough to allow it. Reefs that bleached previously and were still in partial recovery when 2026 arrived face compounded stress. Some sections that experience repeated bleaching events will not recover. The permanent loss of reef structure means the permanent loss of the coastal protection and fishery habitat that reef provides to nearby communities. Ice loss from glaciers and ice sheets that accelerated during the record warmth does not reverse. Sea levels that rose fractionally during the melt event stay at their new height. Coastal infrastructure that was barely above the flood threshold before 2026 now sits below it. The human geography also shifts. Communities that experienced catastrophic flooding, particularly in low-lying coastal and river delta regions, face permanent questions about whether to rebuild in place or move. Climate migration from the most severely affected areas, the dry corridor of Central America, low-lying Pacific Island communities, coastal Bangladesh, the Mekong Delta, accelerates. The cities that receive these migrants face their own capacity pressures. Agricultural zones shift. Farmers in regions that experience severe drought will plant different crops in the years that follow. species better suited to the conditions the climate is now reliably producing, rather than the conditions it produced 50 years ago. This adaptation is real and valuable. It is also a permanent acknowledgement that the old normal is gone. The scientific baseline shifts too. Researchers will study the 2026 El Niño for decades. It will become the reference event against which future El Niños are compared, the way the 1997 to 1998 event was used as the benchmark for the 25 years that followed it. The data gathered during this event will improve models, sharpen forecasts, and inform adaptation planning for communities that survived this one and are trying to prepare for the next, because the next El Niño will develop on top of a planet that is warmer than the one that just experienced this one. The background warming does not pause between events, it continues. The baseline that amplified the 2026 event will be higher still when the next major cycle builds. The history of El Niño is a history of the planet absorbing disruption and reorganizing around a new normal. That process has happened throughout human civilization. Societies have adapted and rebuilt after every event. What is new is the speed. The new normals are arriving faster than the old adaptations can be completed. The recovery from one event overlaps with the preparation for the next one, and the margin between surviving and not surviving narrows with each cycle. The ocean is already cooling slightly from its 2026 peak. The trade winds are beginning to rebuild. The immediate crisis is passing. The permanent consequences are just beginning to show.